Tonight, we want to take time to get a better understanding of the situation in Sudan, where UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is calling for an immediate end to what he calls a nightmare of violence. Just over a week ago, the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF as they're known, seized the besieged city of el-Fasher from Sudanese Army Forces. It's a major turning point in Sudan's war, cementing RSF control of the western Darfur region. Since then, horrifying reports have been emerging from el-Fasher. The RSF is accused of carrying out mass executions and other atrocities. Satellite images taken from space show blood-stained sands. The fate of 200,000 civilians trapped in the city is unclear. Since April of 2023, the RSF has been involved in a power struggle with the Sudanese army, but it's a story that goes far beyond Sudan's border, with numerous global powers playing a role in the conflict.
More than 2 years of brutal war in Sudan have created the world's biggest humanitarian crisis. Thousands have been killed, and millions have been displaced. The war centres on two rival militaries and their fight for power. On the one side is the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemedti. On the other side is the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, led by Abdel Fattah Burhan. Once allies in their fight to overthrow Sudan's former government, they became enemies in the aftermath of the 2021 coup. Abdel Fattah Burhan is Sudan's de facto leader and represents Sudan on the global stage. Hemedti's RSF has its origins in the Janjaweed militia, which was accused of genocide and ethnic cleansing against the Darfur region's non-Arab population in the mid-2000s.
It's history repeating, and it becomes worse every time a place is taken over by the other party.
Over the past 2 years of fighting, both the RSF and the SAF have been accused of war crimes and atrocities. International backers are also alleged to be supplying weapons to the conflict. Multiple UN reports accuse the United Arab Emirates of providing weapons to the RSF, claims Abu Dhabi denies, and Sudan's armed forces have support from Egypt. While those are the two key players, there are plenty of others allegedly providing military support or with strategic interests in the conflict. They're being called on to put an end to the war.
One thing that is essential to stop the fighting is to make sure that no more weapons come into Sudan.
Calls for a ceasefire have done nothing to stop the bloodshed, with both sides determined to claim victory and complete control of Sudan.
Federico Donelli is an associate professor of international relations at the University of Trieste in Italy, and I asked him to explain who supports who in this conflict and why.
Well, when we consider the Sudanese civil war, we have to consider the involvement of multiple actors. As you said, there are two main actors that are Egypt and UAE. But of course, with Egypt, there's also Saudi Arabia. These two actors are backing the Sudanese Army Forces, so Al-Burhan, and it's really about history and geography, I would say, because they've got all tie with Sudan military and share security concern, especially Saudi Arabia in the Red Sea, but also for Egypt is related to the Nile River. On the other hand, we've got the UAE, who support the Rapid Support Forces and the MAT. This is mainly driven by business and strategy, because we have to consider the importance of the access to gold, trade routes, and also influence along the Red Sea corridor. So in short, when we consider Sudanese civil war, we have to consider a much bigger and broader picture with the competition for regional influence among different players.
Mm-hmm. There are many geopolitical interests at play here, as you just pointed out. Some analysts are calling this a proxy war. Would you agree with them?
Not exactly. I can totally understand why they say proxy war, but I think it's important to underline that the core of this civil war is related to internal power struggle between the two security sectors of the Sudanese army. So we've got on one end the formal army and on the other end the paramilitary groups. Of course, if we consider the external players, I think that their involvement, they support with money, weapons, and diplomatic support have turned the war into bigger things. So this is definitely important. So I would say it's not a fully proxy war. It's a domestic conflict with clear regional layers.
Mm-hmm. I want to zoom in on the Gulf monarchies because their engagement in Sudan didn't start just 2 years ago, did it?
No, it didn't start 2 years ago. When we consider the Gulf monarchies, we have to consider that they began to get engaged in Sudan even during the al-Bashir era. And they were engaged because they want to counter the influence of Iran, especially following the Yemen civil war. With the Yemen civil war, Sudan and the whole Horn of Africa became important for regional competition. Then they've got other interests in Sudan. These interests are related to food security, for example, with the land grabbing phenomenon that became really important for Saudi Arabia. And of course, in projecting influence not only against Iran, but also against some other Middle Eastern players like Qatar, Israel, and Turkey.
So we have the UAE backing the RSF. We have Saudi Arabia backing the SAF. How has that, in your opinion, stoked the flames of the internal conflict in Sudan?
I think it makes the things a lot harder. I mean, the UAE has been closer to RSF and Saudi Arabia on the other side. This is a rivalry. This is a new rivalry for the region because they were allied before. And this is a rivalry related to multiple political issues. When we consider the idea of the future of the region, they've got different positions. From UAE side, there's no space for the political Islam in the region. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia is open to get closer to political Islam. And this is something that we have seen not only in Sudan, but also in Yemen. At the same time, I think that the lack of unified Arab states or Gulf position also make weaker any mediation effort, as we have seen with the Quad. It also allows Sudanese actors to play against one side against the other. So they can gain a lot, they can maximize, they benefit from this rivalry.
How much influence, though, in real terms, do they have over the warring factions they support?
Quite a lot. They've got quite a lot of influence, but they are not in total control. I mean, this is important to underline because when we consider the dynamics, the conflict dynamics, we have to be aware that they do not have the full control. Money and logistics gave leverage, but both the army and the RSF act on their own interest. So they are not following the interest or the strategy or the agenda of the Gulf monarchy. Local power dynamics and personal rivalries, so from one side, Al-Burhan, and from the other side, Hemeti, still matter more than any outside patron monarchy.
Now, the UAE has expressed regret over its inaction during the coup in 2021 that overthrew the civilian transition government. Are they getting ready to walk away from the RSF?
I think that behind the UAE position and the current position, there are also the interest in some way to try to reset their image, especially international image with European countries and United States, of course. And maybe by stepping up humanitarian aid or getting more involved in mediation efforts in the next weeks, especially with the atrocities that we have seen in the recent day. And another option would be to tighten control over the gold exports. This is important because for UAE, gold is really a key driver for the involvement in Sudanese civil war, because gold is determinant to provide financial support to the networks of its ally, not only in Sudan, but in the wider region. To do effectively, Abu Dhabi would need to rethink its tie with Emeti, and I'm not so sure that they are ready to do that now.
Mm-hmm. And just to give our viewers some context, much of Sudan's gold is in areas that are currently controlled by the RSF. I want to quickly look at the role Russia plays here, because they have stakes on both sides, don't they?
Yeah, they did. I mean, they do, because they at the beginning they were pretty closer to RSF for the same reason of UAE, so the gold mines. But then, following the rift between the Kremlin and the Wagner group, they decided to adopt a more neutral stance and getting closer to Al Burhan. So the impression is that Russia is trying to see how the things are going in Sudan and then decide on which side bet on.
In your opinion, just to wrap up here, to what extent are all these international players to blame for what the UN has described as the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe?
Unfortunately, I think they do not care so much about it. That's the reality. I mean, the thing is that on the ground, the two faction, of course, but also all these players that support him from behind, the two faction, do not care about the humanitarian crisis and about all the atrocities that we have seen during the last couple of weeks, but more in general during the last 2 years.
That was Federico Donelli of the University of Trieste in Italy. Many thanks.
Thank you.
We want to take a look at a possible path out of this war and bring in Hager Ali. She is a Sudan analyst at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg. Hager, welcome back to DW. Now, the analysts say the warring parties both have a zero-sum approach to this conflict. Would you say this war doesn't end until one side is either defeated or surrenders?
That is quite likely. We've seen in the way that the Sudan Armed Forces have simply retreated from Darfur and left civilians behind to die, that there isn't necessarily an interest in protecting civilians, in putting their interests first. It's very much about guarding their strategic goals. And right now, we can't really tell more than just to not lose against the rapid support forces. So it's not necessarily about winning anymore. It's just not about losing. The same approach really is visible for the rapid support forces, because if they had any higher kind of strategic political goals, it would be quite obvious that using this incredibly brutal approach against civilians that you would also have to govern with at the end of the conflict isn't something that necessarily pans out.
There is speculation that the head of the RSF might seek to rule a Darfur that is no longer part of Sudan. Is that a likely scenario?
At the moment, not necessarily, because we don't really get into a situation like the war in Sudan if there's any sort of political competence or if there's the ability to institutionalize whatever power that you have established on the battlefield. The rapid support forces have been in power before, in cooperation with the civilians, so after the fall of the Omar al-Bashir regime, and then also together with the Sudan Armed Forces. And they have not been able to institutionalize their own transitional regime. So it's not likely that now that there are absolutely no guardrail, there's absolutely no partner that may or may not be a buffer or have any sort of experience in governing, that the rapid support forces are actually able to institutionalize whatever power they have gained in Darfur, because at the end of the day, the ability to be repressive does not equate to the ability to actually run a government.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that they won't try. If they did pursue that road of, breaking away as Darfur that is no longer part of Sudan, what would that mean for the civilians living there?
in practice not mean all too much, because throughout the history, there's always been a discrepancy between the region of Darfur and the rest of the country, simply through the distribution or the makeup of societal groups that you have there. A lot of ethnic minorities or ethno-religious minorities are concentrated in Darfur and have over the decades been neglected by the central government. So secessionist attempts or aspirations aren't necessarily new. And in practice, for the citizens of Darfur, the lived experience was exclusion. It already was discrimination. And also in practice, the reach of the central government didn't even get to Darfur many times. So there are other local authorities that superseded the authority of the central government. So in the day-to-day experience, there may not necessarily be much of a difference simply because the central government didn't have that much of a reach in Darfur and also wasn't interested in integrating Darfur into its governing structure, into its public administration, the way it had with other parts of the country.
At this point, right now, we're seeing the RSF wreaking havoc. The fighting is displacing tens of thousands of people. Of the many international players that are meddling in this conflict, would you consider anyone in a position to mediate?
Mediation has been difficult for a number of reasons, and part of this is because so many have been trying to get involved into the mediation process, and that is also a function of how you relegate Sudan. Is it part of the Middle East, of the Arab world, of the Horn of Africa, of the wider Sahel, or just North Africa in general? And that's why it has also been so incredibly difficult to pinpoint any party that is responsible and that will actually stay at the mediation process and will continue pushing peace negotiations. And
there are three major players. Sorry to jump in there, though. We're looking at the UAE, we're looking at Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and they all have vested interests in what's happening in Sudan. Do you see them in a position to put an end to this conflict? Do they have an interest in being involved in brokering a ceasefire?
For the United Arab Emirates, I would say a definite no, simply because it has been one of the major suppliers of the Rapid Support Forces. For the United Arab Emirates, any involvement in mediation isn't necessarily for the sake of the Sudanese people or for the sake of getting peace in the region. It's quite the opposite. The United Arab Emirates have profilated themselves as a peace spoiler because in the case of Sudan, they have a vested interest in the gold trade and the gold export and gold smuggling out of the country. So even if they were to get involved, and even if it is within their foreign policy strategy, it is not a credible effort. And it's also something that has been unanimously rejected on the ground in Sudan. So the ability to mediate is one thing, and then also the acceptance from the people in Sudan as a mediator is a whole other issue. And it's similar for Egypt, which has traditionally been aligned to the Sudan Armed Forces, simply because the militaries have a shared history. The Egyptian army has supplied the Sudanese army. That negotiation attempt may also, or mediation attempt may also not be accepted by all parties within Sudan. And within, and as regarding to Saudi Arabia, in the past, we've seen that Sudan, again, was not used, or mediation involvement wasn't for the sake of Sudan, but rather to reestablish relations with the United States in the Jeddah process.
All right. So what you're saying is that mediation doesn't seem likely. Let's look at it from the other side then. Could these powers that are influencing the war in Sudan be pressured into withdrawing their support from the warring parties, from, third actors?
That is a very difficult question, or something that's very difficult to achieve because the support for either party isn't necessarily through boots on the ground or being very active, but it's deliberately through sending weapons, which is a comparatively low in risk way of projecting some presence there, but without necessarily being involved and crossing the line of being a party to the conflict. It's also that the involvement through sending weapons weapons is deliberately distributed and bounced around. So we have heard of UK weapons turning up in Sudan that have been likely sent through the United Arab Emirates. That is not a coincidence. That is intentionally to blur and keep the chain of custody in the involvement as murky as possible, because if you're going to find UK weapons in Sudan, you're naturally going to start looking at the UK rather than the United Arab Emirates. And that has been similar with many parties that have been getting into the conflict. So no direct boots on the ground other than mercenary groups, which are private military contractors, so not directly affiliated with governments, or it's very difficult to prove because there's always a level of plausible deniability, or through sending weapons that have been bounced around the region. And then, of course, the illicit trafficking in the region of weapons that has already existed, because Sudan is just embedded basically in an ecosystem of arms trafficking. So there may even be arms and necessary supplies for the conflict that turn up from Mali, bounced around through Niger, through maybe Libya, and Chad, that somehow end up in the conference. And that's why it's so difficult to also use sanctions, because it's not enough to sanction one country. It's not enough to approach one particular border. It's how everything is intermeshed in that particular conflict.
Yeah, just a pointer here. I think the weapons from the UK that you mentioned, the UK government has clarified that it's military equipment, that it's not weapons. And I want to zoom out, though, because the US administration is pushing for a ceasefire as we speak. A previous proposal they put on the table was rejected. How likely do you believe Donald Trump is to put an end to the fighting?
So far, not very likely, I would say, because, again, Sudan is not that much of a priority for the sake of its own. It's always a vehicle of furthering other interests in the region. And Donald Trump has recently entered major deals with the United Arab Emirates and with Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region. So Sudan will be maybe a reason to further those relations, the strategic economic relations in the region. But at the same time, the instability in Sudan is just too lucrative for all parties involved, and it's also not high enough on the list of priorities in foreign policy to really take controversial stances and to push and to accelerate sanctions.
At the beginning of the war, you called for civilian actors to lead peace efforts. Now, we're talking a lot about, all the military factions involved, about the weapons that are being pushed around. At this point in the war, is there civilian leadership in Sudan that could intervene?
Not nationwide, and part of that is also because the center of gravity of that conflict isn't the capital anymore. A lot of mobilization that has happened tended to be around the bigger areas, especially around Khartoum. Also, on the basis or formed on the basis of prior national parties. But we are now looking at wars within wars and conflicts that have broken out within that wider power struggle that now concern local actors. So it's a way of kind of localizing the conflict, which also means that by the way that the war has developed, there will not be one major civilian party that can mediate. But maybe that's also not the way to go anymore, simply because the hyper-centralization of the country and the focus on one major civilian actor to mediate the war was part of the problem, because that always requires parsing the violence. It always requires prioritizing needs and concerns and who is more affected by the conflict. But the country in itself is so heterogeneous that various groups are affected by the conflict in very different ways, with different local constellations of actors, so that they may have to concentrate on regions and sort of federalize a peace process. So no big tent parties may be able to solve the conflict, but simply because we are now looking at wars within wars, it would have to be more local actors.
A tremendously complex picture. Thank you so much for helping us understand it. Hager Ali, Sudan analyst at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies.
Thank you.